mass, like if you have Earth and if you have Apple, it accelerates towards the bigger mass. We call it as a force. So Newton regarded gravity as a force, which is defined as g m1 m2 upon r square. But Einstein said, no, it's not really a force. So the natural question to ask then is, what exactly is it? So okay, to understand that, we'll first have to explain the concept of, to understand the concept of space-time. Okay, so space-time is when you have any event that happens in the universe, it can be spatially described using three dimensions, three position dimensions, which is x, y, and z. Okay. Now, if you include a fourth dimension into it, which tells you when exactly did this event happen, so you call that as the temporal dimension or the time dimension. So you combine the idea of space having three dimensions with the fourth dimension as time, and you combine these two ideas to call it space-time. So Einstein combined these two ideas. Actually, this idea originally came from Minkowski, who said that time by itself and space by itself are doomed to fade into mere shadows. So you have to combine both of them if you want to really explore the reality. Okay, so Einstein said that gravity arises from the shape of space-time. So it's a little weird to understand what is shape of space-time. So to understand that, we'll take an analogy. So the analogy is, take a rubber sheet and you stretch it in all its sides. Now you place a heavy ball, say a bowling ball, in the center of it. So wherever you place it, because of its mass, it will cause a deformation in the rubber sheet. Now, if you have a small marble, like as shown here, if you keep it close to that depression, it will straight away move down that slope and accelerate towards its bigger object. But say if you have another mass, and you, instead of pushing it down the slope, you give it a slight twist. So you make it go around the depression. So once it settles into an orbit, that is how we explain that planets move around a heavy centered like sun in the solar system. So let's see it more formally. So you're considering space-time as a rubber sheet which can be deformed. In any region which is away from massive objects such as stars, your space-time is considered to be absolutely flat. But where you have massive objects, it curves that space-time as if you place a bowling ball that is placed on a rubber sheet to create a cup-like depression. I hope that's clear. Like I said, if you have a marble kept close to that depression, it will roll down the slope as if pulled by a force. So Einstein didn't say it's actually a force. He said it comes from the geometry of space-time, this analogy with the rubber sheet. It's important to understand here is how he explained it was absolutely using abstract mathematics. So what we are trying to understand space-time is using an analogy with the rubber sheet, but it's not really the exact thing. Okay. And if you give a sideways push, the marble will orbit around the bigger ball. Okay. So now we have had an analogy of how space-time looks like. So we finally have an answer how Einstein defined gravity. He said it's a curvature in the geometry of space-time. Okay. So gravity is how much deformation it forms in the space-time. Okay. Now we have to understand a little bit about general relativity. So like I said, Einstein's general theory of relativity, it's a complete quantitative theory that describes everything through highly abstract mathematics. Okay, so the solutions, the theory of general theory of relativity is expressed in the form of interlinked differential equations, much like Maxwell's equations in electromagnetism. So there you have four equations that describe pretty much how charges, accelerating charges, create electromagnetic fields and all. So similarly here in general theory of relativity, you have these set of equations and you call them as field equations. Now, as we had Maxwell equations, they gave you solutions. The vacuum solutions of Maxwell equation are essentially electromagnetic waves. So similarly, field equations give out the solution that there should exist something analogous to electromagnetic waves called gravitational waves. So like I said, Maxwell's equations relate electric charge and the electromagnetic field. So field equations relate mass and the space-time curvature, which can also be called as gravity. The solution of the Maxwell's equation are electromagnetic waves. Similarly, the solution to field equations are gravitational waves. They may not be waves in the more physical sense, but we understand the analogy between the two, and hence we call them as gravitational waves. Okay. So let's talk just about gravitational waves. So essentially these are ripples in the space-time. So, if you have a water pond, if you throw a pebble in it, the way it forms ripples that propagate in all directions. Similarly, consider the space-time like I described as a rubber sheet. It's not just 2D. It's like it's all over. Now, if there are events, they are moving masses, heavy masses, say accelerating heavy masses, they will generate gravitational waves, and these gravitational waves will propagate in all directions. So when you say, okay, like do you have gravitational waves associated with normal objects, say a pen or say a laptop or whatever? So the thing is, the masses associated here are really, really small. To have considerable, even that considerable is really small. So to have the detectable amount of gravitational waves, we can only detect this generated from energetic processes like merging of black holes or neutron stars and a black hole merging and all. Okay. Like in electromagnetism, you have when a charge accelerates, it will produce oscillating electric magnetic fields which propagate as electromagnetic wave. Massive accelerating objects also disrupt this space-time in a very similar fashion and give out these waves of undulating space-time. So, and these propagate in all directions away from the source. Okay. And these cosmic ripples, they travel at the speed of light. And as they travel, they also tell us information. They carry within themselves the information of the origin of those gravitational waves. So if we study gravitational waves, we can understand what sources actually produce those waves. To give you a more physical feel of what this is, let's look at a simulation. I hope you can see this. So it's a binary system. So consider two black holes, or consider two neutron stars, or a neutron star and a black hole. They accelerate around they rotate around each other, and as they come closer, the acceleration increases. Eventually, they merge together. So as these heavy masses are accelerating, they generate these ripples in the space-time, which we call it as gravitational waves. So as we can understand how energetic and violent this process can be, and hence this gravitational wave, as it propagates through space over years, light years of distance, when it finally reaches Earth, we are finding a way to how to detect it so as to understand what happened there years ago. Okay. So to begin with, we said we'll start with gravity. We established that we have understood what space-time fabric is. We've also understood what gravitational waves are in a little bit of general theory of relativity that is of relevance to us right now. We'll come to gravitational wave detection now. First, we'll ask the question, why should you detect it? Why should you care about it? Okay, that's a valid question to ask. Okay, so historically what happened was, the way we have been understanding the universe is using telescopes and detectors that essentially observe through electromagnetic radiation. So you're essentially just capturing those photons that are coming to you after traveling through all of space, and then you're looking at it, you're looking at the Doppler shift, blue shifted, red shifted, and then you're trying to make conclusions about the universe. So the only way we have been trying to understand largely about the universe is through electromagnetic radiation. But the problem with electromagnetic radiation is that as it travels through space, it undergoes some alterations and distortions, because you know that electromagnetic waves, as they travel, it can be absorbed or reflected or refracted or bent and can be Doppler shifted. But gravitational waves, they are completely unrelated to electromagnetic radiation. They interact very weakly with matter. So they travel through space virtually unimpeded. So you can understand how the universe was as it actually was. Okay, that is the advantage of studying gravitational waves over just electromagnetic radiation. Okay. Unseeable wonders, in a sense that since you're not using photons, you're not actually seeing it, you are sort of trying to develop an ear to hear the gravitational waves, if you can get what I mean. Okay. So I'll just give you a brief outline of the timeline of gravitational wave detection. So Einstein predicted the existence of gravitational waves in 1916. Actually, this wasn't the first time. Poincare already sort of told that this should happen, but the more documented version of it was given by Einstein, who said the gravitational wave exists and said it in 1916. So the first gravitational wave detector, which we call it as LIGO, we'll talk about it later. So the construction was completed in 1999. The first search started in 2002, but for 9 years, no single detection could ever happen. So Einstein also said that although gravitational waves exist, it will never be possible for you to detect it. That very much was coming closer to the actual reality, that we might never be able to detect it. But then they realized they changed the sensitivity of the gravitational wave detector, and the first time they could detect actually was in 2015. So we'll look at it, how it was detected, where it was detected. An important point to note here is the way you detect it, it was through changes in arm lengths. We'll discuss about it. But the order of that change was, you take an atom, it was smaller than the atomic distance. You have to go to the nucleus size. The nucleus size is 10 to the power minus 15 meter. It was 1,000 times of that. So it was of the order of 10 to the power minus 18 meter. So you can understand how small that change was, and to detect it is really a challenge. Okay, the first gravitational detector was a very easy concept. So Joseph Weber at the University of Weberland, or University of Maryland, so he considered solid aluminum cylinders of length 2 meters and 1 meter in diameter. He suspended it using steel wires. The idea was very simple, much like if you have a tuning fork, and if it's say if you set it in oscillation, and if you have an oscillation which is in resonance with this, so you can see that the amplitude increases. So essentially what he did was, you have these aluminum bars. If a corresponding frequency of gravitational wave passes through it, so it will set these in resonance, and so its amplitude should increase. He converted it in electrical signals, and those electrical signals were to be studied. So he planned out the whole thing. He said, okay, 1660 hertz is the frequency that it should detect. Okay, but the problem was it never worked. So they couldn't detect any of the gravitational waves. The problem being, they're suspending it using steel wires. So there was thermal noise associated with it, and to be able to extract the signals of gravitational waves from this thermal noise was next to impossible then. So this didn't work at all. So then they came up with even more smart way of detecting gravitational waves, which was through using interferometers. For those of you who are not very comfortable with what interferometers are, so they are a very simple devices that uses some beam splitters and some mirrors. And what you have is, they employ the principle of interference. So say if two waves are in phase, they interfere constructively. If the two waves that superimpose, they're out of phase, it undergoes destructive interference. Okay, so the design of Michelson interferometer is this. You have a beam splitter, you have two mirrors, okay, placed orthogonal to each other. Now you have a laser source, it sends out the beam. So the beam gets reflected here, goes along this path, another part of it gets transmitted. Now this reflected part gets reflected through this mirror, comes through this path again, gets transmitted and comes along this line. The one that went here gets reflected, comes to the beam splitter and gets reflected. So it also comes down here. There will naturally be some part that goes in this direction and goes back here. We don't care about it. We care what comes to the detector. Here is the detector. So if you have equal path lengths and all, and the way you have compensated for that path difference that the beam is traveling, you will have conditions of constructive or destructive interference. That is basic to understand. If you have any problems, you can ask me, I can clarify here. So basically what you're using is, so it all depends on the path length between these two, between the beam splitter and mirror 1 and beam splitter and mirror 2. If they are of equal paths, say they satisfy the condition of constructive interference. Okay, so you get a bright fringe and dark fringe and all that. Okay, so how did they employ this idea into the gravitational waves? Okay, let's see it. To understand that, we have to understand how gravitational wave propagates. Okay, so I'll give a crude analogy using the same electromagnetic waves. So we know electromagnetic waves are essentially electric field and magnetic field both in orthogonal directions, and they are both orthogonal to the direction of propagation. I hope you're familiar with this. So now when they propagate through matter, they set the atoms in oscillation and all only in this plane of vibration of electric field. So nothing happens along the direction of propagation. If you have studied a little bit of optics or electromagnetism, you can understand through this. If not, it's okay. We'll understand right from here. So when they're traveling, so it doesn't set the atoms in oscillation in the direction of propagation. Much like that, when gravitational waves propagate, so say if they're propagating perpendicular to the screen, so it will set the matter in oscillation in perpendicular directions. So there'll be, say, if there is squeezing in this direction, there'll be elongation in the other direction, and this switches at a particular frequency. So this keeps on happening. The squeezing and then elongation, then contraction and elongation, this continues. So gravitational waves causes this space itself to stretch in one direction and simultaneously compress in the perpendicular direction. But this won't happen in the direction of propagation. It will happen only in the perpendicular plane of the direction of propagation. I hope that's clear. If not, you can ask me right now. So what they did was, it's smart. So in Michelson interferometer, you essentially have two arms, right? So when gravitational wave, say, passes perpendicular, say I have this L shaped, and I say my gravitational wave passes perpendicular to it, so it will cause changes in the arm length of these two arms. Okay, nothing will happen along the perpendicular direction, right? So this will become shorter, this will become longer. At the next moment, this will become shorter, this will become longer. So as this becomes longer and say this becomes shorter, that the distance the laser has to travel before it hits the detector changes in the two arms, which is detectable. Because earlier, say I set them as path difference 0, I should get a particular type of fringe. Or say I convert into electrical signal, so I get a particular type of signal. Now say if the arm length has changed, so this should cause some detection as an electrical signal, which will tell you, yes, the arm length has changed a bit. That will tell you that gravitational wave has propagated. So in Michelson interferometer, like I said, this causes one arm of the interferometer to get longer while the other gets shorter, and then vice versa. Back and forth. It happens till the wave passes, and we call this as differential arm motion. Okay. To understand this properly, we'll look at a simulation that explains it really, really well. Okay, so you should be able to see this and hear this.
To measure this stretching and squeezing, Ray turned to a device called an interferometer. A laser beam is split and sent down a pair of long perpendicular tubes, each precisely the same length. The two beams bounce off mirrors and recombine back at the base. The light waves come back lined up in such a way that they cancel each other out.
And you add them together, you get nothing. You get a zero, a big fat zero. No light gets detected at the photodetector.
But when a gravity wave comes along, it distorts space and changes the distance between the mirrors. One arm becomes a little longer, the other a little shorter. An instant later, they switch. This back and forth stretching and squeezing happens over and over until the wave has passed. As the distances change, so does the alignment between the peaks and valleys of the two returning light waves, and the light waves no longer cancel each other out when added together in the recombined beam. Now some light does reach the detector, with an intensity that varies as the distance between the mirrors varies. Measure that intensity, and you're measuring gravity waves.
The light takes longer time in here than it did in this arm. Now it takes a shorter time, and these things don't cancel so beautifully anymore.
Yeah, I hope it's clear. So I'd like to ask, if it's not clear, we can discuss it right now, or we can take questions at the end, whatever you like. So if you have doubts about this, we can discuss it right now. Okay. If not, we'll continue with gravitational wave detection. So like they explained in the video, so what you're using laser, and this has an interferometer, and using this device as a gravitational wave detector. The whole principle being that these arm lengths change as the gravitational wave passes through it. Okay, so now comes the question of current detectors. Okay, so the oldest advanced detector that we have had is LIGO. So one is in Hanford, US, another one is Livingston, US. Later come up Virgo, which is located in Italy. Then came an underground detector, which recently became functional in 2020 at Kagra in Japan. There is even more interesting gravitational wave detector, which is space-based. So we'll talk about it in the coming slide, and I'll show you a little bit about it. The proposed most advanced gravitational wave detector should be Einstein telescope, which is proposed. It'll take another, say, 10, 12 years for it to be an actual reality now. It's proposed in the Netherlands, Belgium, and Germany border. And then the one that should be the most exciting for us should be the LIGO that's coming up in India. It's supposed to be, the land is in Maharashtra, and it's proposed to be established by 2027. Let's see, we'll create lots of jobs. Okay, so LIGO, the full form is Laser Interferometer Gravitational Wave Observatory. So like we discussed, I want to repeat this because this is the essential working of a gravitational wave detector. So a laser beam is split to travel down two perpendicular 4-kilometer tunnels. Now this arm length can vary. What type of source do you want to detect? What frequencies you want to capture? Decides all these parameters. The arm length, the type of laser you're using, the wavelength of the laser, the type of mirrors you're using, the type of cavity you're using, because you employ Fabry-Perot cavity in these arm lengths. So all of that and a lot more gets employed in deciding what sources you want to detect. So for LIGO, it's 4-kilometer arm lengths. This is also 4 kilometer, this is also 4 kilometer in L shape. So when a gravitational wave passes LIGO, the tunnels deform slightly and the distance traveled by each beam changes. So they no longer cancel out, and the first detection was of the order of 10 to the minus 18 meter for a 4-kilometer arm length. So naturally you can understand, if you increase this arm length, say go on and on, so the larger the arm length you have, the more detectable the signal can be. Okay, but the problem then comes is you cannot infinitely go on, because first of all you have to construct it, not just on paper, and then the defect caused by the curvature of Earth becomes dominant. So you have to do away with that, and there are a lot more challenges than just that. So the current detectors, Livingston is just L-shaped Michelson interferometer that we have already seen. Hanford is also the same, 4-kilometer arm length each. Then there is one in Japan called Kagura. It's an underground detector with an arm length of 3 kilometers. And the Virgo is in Italy. It also has an arm length of 3 kilometers. The interesting one, the Einstein telescope, has an arm length of 10 kilometers, and it doesn't have just 2 arms. It's actually a triangle. So it's more like an equilateral triangle. And the smart thing they've done is, you don't send just one beam across it. You send one beam here, say one beam here. Then you have another beam source, laser source here. You set another beam here, another beam here. Then you have third laser source here, and you set 2 beams each. Okay, they are not mixing, okay, in separate channels. Okay, and then using different wavelengths of these lasers, they are able to detect it. Effectively works as 3 gravitational wave detectors right at just one spot. So this is expected to be the most sensitive and detector so far proposed. This is a super cool detector which is proposed to be established in space. I'd like to show you a video of how do they plan to put it in space. So what essentially they have is, they'll have 3 satellites that are put in orbit in such a way that these send out beams. It has to be very it has to be very precise. These have to remain fixed in orbit, and the arm length doesn't have to change with time, because if it changes with time, that is the whole argument that you're saying a gravitational wave is detected. So this can't change with time, and then this whole thing goes around. So the advantage it has is, if you have it on Earth, so the seismic noise is too much. So if there are seismic waves because of contact with Earth, so because of that, there will be noises that you will be detecting, and you might confuse it with the gravitational wave. So it becomes difficult to extract that signal from the noise. But if you have it in space, no contact with the Earth as such, obviously there are other challenges that comes in. But yeah, you're sort of getting a trade-off between one thing over the other. This is cool. Let's see how far they can go. Okay. Okay. So the current positions of all these detectors, so 2 are in US, the oldest ones. Here is Virgo. There's another Geo 600. This is Kagura in Japan, and LIGO India, which is supposed to come up in 2027. Okay. So here I'll take a pause. I might have rushed through things. So I'd like to ask if it's clear to you how exactly what gravitational waves are and the detection part or the interferometer part, anything about it. And you can of course ask at the end also, but if you want to ask right away, we have time.
Ma'am, hello?
Yeah.
Hello, Pratna. Can you hear me? Yeah, so you mentioned about Einstein telescope effectively acting as three observatories at once.
Yeah.
So, like, what purpose would it serve? Like, if you want to just increase, like, the accuracy with which you measure, you just, I don't get why having three parallel detectors would somehow get better information, right? About.
Yeah. So
Like, I
if
don't
you're having three
understand that.
detectors, it's not increasing the accuracy, because if you're using a different configuration of the laser wavelength and etc., so you're essentially targeting a different source out there in space. So say you have all sort of waves that are coming towards Earth, but you're able to detect only in a very, very narrow range of frequencies. So if you're using different set of lasers, you are trying to capture different sources. So eventually, using at the same spot, you're trying to cover a broader range of gravitational waves, not just that one. Because if you have different lasers, it will not improve the frequency, but it will definitely increase the coverage of the space.
Ma'am, but for interference to occur, the laser should be same, right? I mean, we can't use two different lasers to have interference like that.
The interference that's happening is just using that particular laser. Let me show you. Let me see if I have that diagram with me. It will make things more clearer. Yeah, I hope you can see my screen. So here is Einstein telescope. Okay. So what you're doing is, so if essentially there's not three, there's six. But okay, forget about it. Let's just talk about three. What they did was, so consider you have a laser source here. You send out this particular laser wavelength in both directions. Okay. So they're interfering right here at the detector itself. So two different wavelengths are not interfering. The one that goes out through here gets detected here. Okay. The two then same for here. If the laser goes through this, goes here, and then is detected back here. Similarly for this. Okay, so you're essentially using this tunnel of 10 kilometers to serve different purposes. So you've chosen the land. Now you just send different tunnels of lasers. They are not interfering. Like blue and red will not interfere. Red will interfere with red right at the detector. I hope that makes it clear.
Oh, okay. Then space telescope should have highest sensitivity, right? Space based.
That's not so easy to say. Okay, yes, definitely. If you consider the, am I presenting? Yeah, you can see. If I consider just the distance between the beam splitter and the mirror, so all these have like 3 kilometer, 4 kilometer, 10 kilometer. The proposed distance LISA will have between the satellites, it's 2.5 million kilometer. So definitely on that front, nothing can beat it. It'll be very sensitive. But the problem is, if you go out in space, there are noises like, say, if you have solar wind, every tiny particle that hits the thing will be registered as a noise. So when even on ground, when you send out this laser beam, when laser hits it, there is something called as quantum noise associated with this, something called as short noise associated with it, thermal noise associated with it. But in space, all this will be reduced because you'll have low temperature, so thermal noise should be reduced. But because of this motion and the configuration of satellites, this can cause trouble. So you'll be cutting down on these particular noises that are on the ground, but there'll be other noises that will come up.
Oh, okay.
Hey, Pratna, just to like follow up on the three different bandwidths question. So effectively, they'd still have the same minimum bandwidth, right? The low frequency will still be the same for all, let's say 3 or even 6 of them. Do you have some sort of like number for what the high, the upper end of each of these frequency bandwidths would be? Do you have like numbers?
Let me see. I think I have it. I just have to find if I can find it right now. Give me a second. I can sure tell you.
That's no problem. I mean, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I can tell you. Okay, I'll give you the exact numbers maybe by the end of the talk. I just have to look it up.
Yeah, sure.
The thing is,
no problem.
when you have a set of, so say you have one particular interferometer, L-shaped itself. Don't consider all three. Okay, you're just one at one particular vertex. So the thing is, with you plot something called as a noise plot. I can show you how that looks like. Using that noise plot, you find what is the effective range of frequencies within which it will work. It's not like the lowest is fixed and then all you are going for is the highest. No, it's like a fixed range.
I mean, I mean, like at what is the upper end at which it, it kind of, you can't consider it as, you can't take it as signal, like gravitational wave signal for sure anymore.
It varies for different detectors.
So I mean, there has to be a cutoff, right?
Yeah, definitely a cutoff.
I mean, in a sense that.
Yeah, I get your question. I think at the end of the talk, I can look it up and I'll tell you about what is the upper cutoff for Einstein telescope. That's the highest that's proposed till now. So beyond that, you can't detect. Even if there are gravitational waves having frequency above that, you'll not be able to detect it.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, any other question?
Am I audible?
Yes.
I have a question. You said the interferometer it has two arms, and the change in the laser beam's path length will cause constructive interference, which will be detected by a photodetector. And how exactly do we synthesize the gravitational wave equation or waveform and get its frequency from this constructive interference?
So far, what I've told is, so at least you'll register that there was a change in the arm length, and which is detected at the photodetector. You're trying to convert it into an electrical signal. Okay. So now I can show you how gravitational waves should sound like. Okay. So normally you'll have a particular, you can convert it into sound signals, right? So
how do we calculate the gravitational wave equation or frequency waveform using this signals? That's what I'm asking.
That will be a little more involved for me to answer this point, because I don't know the exact mechanism of how you can extract the frequency out of it. Because first you have to get rid of all the potential noise sources. So it's not a one-step process for sure. So you have to get rid of all 7-8 type of noises. I can show you at the end what those are, and then you have to do something which I am not comfortable telling right this point, because I don't know what exactly do you do to figure out the frequency. But sure, after eliminating the noise sources by further analysis and numerical simulation and other stuff, you can get to understand what frequency it was.
Okay. Is there a wave equation for gravitational waves?
Yes, it all comes from field equations actually. It's the wave equation as you know it, like differential of x with t, second derivatives, I think must be in the terms of how Einstein described it in general theory of relativity, which I don't think it's the scope of this present talk.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, just one question here. So the one where we had 3 arms for detection, so more than the sensitivity that has to be questioned, wouldn't it just be that you're detecting the gravitational waves using multiple sets of laser beams, so you're not actually taking something as noise, or
you're not taking something
it's kind of confirming the same detection with multiple sets of laser beams?
No, not really, because to detect a particular frequency, you have to decide the parameters of the detector. Once you've set the parameters, there's a very finite range of frequencies you can detect. Okay, so suppose vague, okay, arbitrary, say 20 units is the value that the first arm can detect. Say 50 units is the 50 units plus minus 10 is the range the second arm can detect. Similarly, say 90 units plus minus some range is what this can detect. So eventually you are detecting different sources. Using different parameters, you cannot target just one source unless that source lies in this overlapping range. So say if this has the range 10 to 30 and this has the range 20 to 40, so eventually 20 to 30 is overlapping between the two. So if the signal falls in this category, you might be able to detect in both the arms. but it's, I think Einstein telescope is designed for different to detect different frequencies. So essentially, you will be detecting different sources. But if you want to confirm if what you've detected, so what happened was the first signal that was ever detected. First, it was observed at say LIGO Hanford, and then the same was confirmed. Yes, it was also detected at Livingston. So these have very much the same configurations. So they were able to target that very source of a particular frequency, and then both were able to tell that yes, this was detected.
Okay, thanks.
I have one more question.
Yes.
From the detected observation, from the detected waveform, we can predict or estimate the masses of the two sources.
Yeah.
So how is it done? How is it being done?
Yeah, so the same answer that I gave for your frequency, that I won't be able to tell you how exactly it's done. Okay, but all I know is through eliminating noises and further processing, you can find out what essentially were the masses of the system and what system could it be by looking at the frequency.
Okay, can you use Schrodinger equation to analyze this?
Sorry, can you repeat?
Can you use Schrodinger wave equation to analyze these gravitational waves?
Definitely, the procedure that must be established to identify this, it's like backtracing. So given the frequency you're trying to find out, so say Einstein might have done is like, okay, given two masses, this is the interaction and this is how the equation should be, and this should give me a wave of particular frequency. Now you're sort of backtracing because you know the frequency. Now you're trying to find out the masses. It's not such an easy process. The processing of this data requires hours and days and weeks of working of supercomputers altogether. So it's not so easy for me to tell you how exactly it's done, but it's the backtracing of the field equations essentially.
Instead of using field equations, can we use Schrodinger wave equation to simplify this process?
Right now, general theory of relativity has, as it has been established, was considered in the classical forms. But if you're going into the directions of quantum electrodynamics or relativistic quantum mechanics, sure, I think there will be advanced topics that deal with how do you apply a quantum mechanical picture of this whole scenario. But again, beyond the scope of this talk.
Okay, thank you.
I wanted a clarification on something. So, in the video of the space-based observatory, the plane of the triangle is the orientation of that plane is changing as it orbits, right? Is that done to make sure that it doesn't have any blind spots, or is there some other reason for that?
That's a good point about blind spots, actually. The first thing is, essentially, you have to configure in such a way that this arm length should not change. So, if fixed it at 2.5 million kilometers, it should not change. So the three are configured together such that this happens. And then, like you mentioned, blind spots. So, like for others, I'll just tell what blind spot is. So, if you have a L-shaped interferometer that's located on the ground, okay, so you're essentially targeting a very narrow region in the space from which, if there are gravitational wave detectors, it will be able to detect. Because like I said, it causes change in this arm length if it's traveling perpendicular to it. So say if I have a gravitational wave that's going along this, so it will not set the one that's parallel to it in motion. Okay, so there'll be blind spots in the sky coverage, in the space coverage, that you will not be able to detect. So I think I might have to look it up, but yes, that could be one of the reasons why they have configured in such a way so as to cover maximum sky. But I think there still are blind spots for LISA also. Okay, so we'll just quickly finish a few things, then we can take up some extra things that I'll just show the noise plots and source plots in the end. Okay, so till now we have covered everything about detection and have told about major type of detectors. So the most interesting one for us could be LIGO India, supposed to be situated at a suburban area in Maharashtra. So this is the drawing of the proposed LIGO India observatory. It is also L-shaped with greater arm length. Yeah, I'll just conclude by talking about gravitational wave astronomy. So this is essentially the branch of observational astronomy that uses these gravitational waves to collect the observational data about neutron stars and black holes, what type are merging and all that. This is a recent branch compared to other branches of astronomy, and it gives a very different way of understanding about the space other than just looking at electromagnetic radiation. So this is a very recent observation. LIGO, Virgo, and Kagra, all three, like Yukta asked if they'll be able to detect. So these have configurations very close to each other. They have overlapping range of frequencies it can detect, and hence they can detect two mergers of a neutron star with a black hole. The details of which can be found on the LIGO site. Okay, so I'll just quickly tell you these were the references I've used, and so okay, one thing is, it's in fact very difficult to detect gravitational waves because of the order of magnitude being 10⁻⁻18 meters, like we discussed for the first detection. It can even be smaller for other frequencies and other sort of detections. So, and it employs large infrastructure because you have to take kilometers of arm length, which are very difficult to construct and to maintain, reduce the noises. You have to use cryogenic agents to cool down various type of noises. So after all that, I'll just end it with Star Wars reference that says, okay, despite all this, never tell me the odds. So yeah, I'll stop the presentation here. You can continue asking the questions, and I'll show you the noise plots and the source plots.
Ma'am, hello?
Yes.
Now, what about gamma telescopes? It also is very powerful, right? It can detect many things.
Yeah, it can detect many things. We have to find out what exactly the specifications are. Okay, I'm not sure if they're exactly talking about gravitational waves there.
But for detecting black hole, scientists have used X-ray telescopes like that.
So there are different ways of how you can detect the same thing. So one way can be you're trying to look at how you're capturing the light essentially, or different ways of looking at it. One way can be you're looking at this undulations of space-time. Okay, so you design a totally different detector for it. X-ray detection is essentially electromagnetic radiation, right? So I said there's an alternative to understanding space other than electromagnetic radiations, which are gravitational waves, and that is what is employed in Einstein telescope versus gamma telescope.
Oh.
I have a doubt.
Yes.
Can you suggest some books for further studies in this field, gravitational astronomy?
So first of all, you'll have to understand fair amount of general theory of relativity to understand field equations and how this has come about. Then for starters, I can tell you, LIGO has LIGO official site. LIGO Caltech has a very elementary and very beautiful descriptions of everything that you need to know. What are starting from what is a gravitational wave to everything that you need to know. Then there is build a detector workshop by LIGO India. Okay, maybe I can copy the link and send it there. Here, it was a workshop recently conducted at the end of May, and they discussed about all sort of technicalities of what you need to understand, not just about gravitational waves, about the noises particularly. To understand all the noises, how do you derive it, how do you minimize it, how do you plot it, and also how do you eliminate it while understanding the sources. I think you can look at it. They have lectures right there, so you can access them, or you can access the LIGO official site for now. Otherwise, it's the standard books on general theory of relativity. And there is one more paper that you can refer. This talks about again the technicalities of all the optical instruments that you're employing. So essentially, interferometer, like I explained, it's just beam splitters and mirrors. That's not how you build a detector. Actually, that has to be this sensitive. So there have to be very wise choices of mirror coatings and mirrors, the suspensions. You have to have a seismic isolator that prevents it from these noises, seismic noises, and a lot more things than that. And there is something called a squeezed light, which is basically employs quantum optics. And so you're trying to reduce quantum noise and short noise there, which is some cool terms I'll throw there. If you're interested, you can look it up.
Hello, I want to say one thing. Doesn't C3PO say the chance of navigating through the asteroid field is approximately 3,720 to 1. It's actually, he would say 37,000 something, not 3,000.
Yes, you can definitely reach out to this guy there. It was the only decent reference I could find. I didn't have the time to watch the movie again and find this particular scene. So I hope you can bear with me for this particular thing.
Ma'am, hello?
Yes.
Ma'am, is there any internships offering related to this?
You can definitely reach out to faculties at IUCAA. There are active research going on gravitational wave astronomy. You can also do access this LIGO India University of Glasgow website. They have the talks from eminent scientists in gravitational wave astronomy. You can always reach out to them. I don't know about internship program. There was one ICTS summer school on gravitational waves and all. You can check out their website. Or there are workshops. This was the first workshop they continued for next year, the coming years also. So you can keep a look at this. Yeah.
You can also check POCNet's website out. There is something called as POCNet who are collaborating currently with LIGO. You can check their site also.
Yeah, since we're done with this, you can keep the question coming. I'll just show you something.
Just a thought, like having a setup on some planet which, like, let's say moon, which is not active geologically and which does have like very rare atmosphere, would it be less costly than having the LISA setup? I don't know.
You have to launch those satellites from there. Yeah, you can do that actually.
Yeah,
it's a good idea.
Maybe it might be less costly. I don't know.
Do that.
Swastik, who's going to pay for the fuel to go there, man? Swastik, who's going to pay for the fuel to go there, man?
Then what about tying? Hello?
Yeah, go ahead.
What about tying all the 3 satellites with DNA? Because DNA is very long, right?
Who is gonna go with the DNA? That's the point then. Who is gonna go with the DNA? Maybe he can. Yeah, maybe we can have a setup when we have the moon colonies. I don't know. Yes.
Okay. Sorry to interrupt, Swastik. For the people who are interested in knowing a little bit about noise sources, so this is how a noise plot looks like. So strain, it's a little involved thing. You can sort of ignore it for now. So what you're essentially looking at is for a particular range of frequencies, what is the type of the noise that's dominating? So say you have quantum vacuum noise. Okay, so the laser beam you're using also affects the measurement that you're doing. So you have to use a particular kind of laser which is more squeezed and advanced type. The seismic noise, which is more so in this range of frequency from 0 to 10, this particular noise dominates. So if you're trying to make a detector that works in this frequency range, you'll have to seriously do away with seismic noise. So I hope you understand how this works. So say if you have coating Brownian noise. So coating Brownian noise is essentially the suspension fibers that you're using. It has thermal noise, and then there is mirror coating on the mirrors, which cause coating Brownian noise. So if you're trying to work in these frequency range, it has a considerable contribution to the noise sources. So if you're developing a detector working in a very specified frequency range, you try to eliminate that particular noise sources. Maybe you have to compensate by you'll have some other noise source that comes up. Okay, so like one idea I had about this, since you're using suspension fibers to hang the mirrors, which are causing the thermal noise and all. So there's the idea of having magnetic levitation to keep the mirror in place without actually touching anything, so, which is a cool idea. But the problem is you'll have magnetic noise then, and it's very difficult to produce strong enough electromagnetic field which is stable, keeps it in position, not at all shaking. All those problems come up. I hope you can appreciate how this is done. Okay, and this is how the source budget of a particular detector looks like. So you have a frequency range, and then you tell, okay, the detector that you have developed, what frequency range will it effectively work in? So LIGO and advanced LIGO essentially work in this frequency range of this 1 to 10 to the power 4 hertz. Okay, so now, but if you want to detect massive binaries or galactic binaries, they essentially emit out in this frequency range. This is the stochastic background which is emitted in this range, which are not detecting at all. So majorly the type of detectors we have is here. So we are detecting compact binary in spirals and supernova and etc.
Do you have any plots where the Einstein telescope is included there?
The plot, let me see.
Because I mean I would think that the bandwidths overlap a lot. So I mean obviously I might be wrong, because if they're pouring in that much resources.
So here are all the parameters as far as I can recall. Yeah, this paper deals with all parameters. Let me see if there's a nice plot. This is quantum mass. Okay, essentially yeah, so it's using 3 different interferometers, right? So ET, B, C, and D, these refer to all those 3. And this is supposed to be the noise plot for Einstein telescope.
I mean, there's a lot of overlap, so I don't.
Yeah, there is an overlap, but the idea was that they will change the parameters such that they are able to cover more different frequencies of gravitational waves. There's an overlap, but I think the way it is designed, it won't be exact. It's not meant to detect the same thing in 3 different detectors, as far as I know.
Okay. Okay, yeah, thanks.
Can you explain about the polarization of gravitational waves?
Sorry, I couldn't hear you.
Can you explain about the polarization of gravitational waves?
No, definitely not. I can explain about polarization of electromagnetic waves, but not gravitational waves, because again, the most of the questions that you're interested in have to deal with general theory of relativity. For that, you have to understand what is gravitational wave, not just mathematically, but how do you give it a more physical picture, and then to understand polarization of what. Okay, I can tell you briefly about, there are 2 types of polarizations. Okay, let me show you the 2. I think I have it. Just a second. So there is something which causes is squishing and expansion in circular form. There's another that causes in elliptical form. That's one way to categorize this polarization. So there could be in-depth discussion about how exactly this is defined. But let's see if I have it. Okay, I have just. Yeah, I hope you can see this. So here essentially, so these 2 actually refer to 2 different type of polarization of gravitational waves. So it will be difficult for me to explain you how exactly this works, but the way it squishes and changes the dimension of the matter sort of decides the polarization of the gravitational wave. It's not very easy to say, much like in electromagnetic waves, you have, okay, what is the rotation of electric field vector? So you can have some analogous vectors that you can define here, which have to heavily do with general theory of relativity. You'll have to dig deep into it to understand this.
Okay.
It has a non-Euclidean plane of geometry.
Yes, it has. So.
Oh.
Okay. If you can see and appreciate, LIGO is essentially a Michelson interferometer, but what they have is they send it through, it goes again, there's a reflection, then there's compensation, then there's multiple reflections before it even reaches the beam splitter. After the beam splitter, there's something called as Fabry-Perot cavity. Those of you who have taken the optics course will know what Fabry-Perot cavity is. So it essentially increases the arm length more than, like, we have just 4 kilometers, but it undergoes multiple oscillation in that 4 kilometers. So that essential distance traveling is increased and the intensity that you'll be able to detect is also increased. Okay, just if you're interested. So as part of the workshop that I mentioned, we were supposed to submit our own idea of the detector. So like I told you about Einstein telescope, this was like a planar thing situated on a plane. But what about gravitational waves which are traveling perpendicular to it? Okay, it doesn't cause, perpendicular to it is detected. If it's traveling in the plane of it, you'll not be able to detect it, for which it's parallel. Okay, so it reduces the space coverage. So what you do is you instead take 3-arm detector, very much like Einstein, but it has to be all orthogonal to each other. Okay, so here is your main system. You send out beams here. Okay, one channel separately, beams here, not interfering the first one, and then third one in these two. So it was supposed to be placed underground, which gives certain advantages over on the ground. The details of which is, I don't know, not really relevant right now. But if you're interested, I can discuss this too. Yeah, so this is how you generate a noise plot. There is actually a package called PikeWink, through which even if you design a gravitational detector, you'll be able to come up with, you set the parameters there, and it sort of gives you how the noises will be. You can keep shooting the questions.
Hello?
Yes.
How they are designing with a perfect, accurately long, equal length of pipes? I mean, even a change as small as 1 centimeter can deviate, right?
Yeah, these are technical challenges which, as theoreticians, we don't care about. It's a challenge that comes when you're actually constructing it. There are ways to do away with it, like the laser itself is telling you if there is a distance, it will not interfere destructively, right? So if you have set up the whole thing, you turn on your laser and you see, okay, no, it's not it is not destructive interference. You can tell, okay, there is a difference already, even without detecting the gravitational waves. There are even more advanced engineering tools that can help us in taking care of the curvature and the distance, I think.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, tell me again the Python package, the name of the Python package.
Sure, I can type it out here. Do refer to that website of the workshop. It also has an entire lecture on how do you get started with PikeWink, and there's if I can find it, let me tell you the name of the speaker. It also gives you a sample Jupyter notebook wherein they have done it for some values of LIGO parameters. So if you go to that website, yeah, there's a lecture by Dr. Jamie Rollins, which is titled Introduction to PikeWink. So there you can know all about PikeWink. And then a later detector designed by Dr. Kevin Kunz. So yeah, you can refer there.
Hey, Prarthana, this tetrahedral detector, is this something that you had designed as part of some project you've done?
Yeah. So it's not an actual thing.
Very cool. Okay, so how far did you go? What other specifications did you for instance, did you calculate like the antenna functions and whatnot?
Yeah, no, it was like a 3-day thing. We were supposed to submit our idea, justify it, and then you have to give the noise plot and the source plot. So
So source plot as in
source plot means what sources will it be targeting? So what frequency
so the
range?
Frequency bandwidth. Okay,
yeah,
okay.
in that
Fine,
sense.
fine.
So it had advantages over the space coverage particularly. There was actually a paper we came across that very beautifully describes the antenna pattern. We didn't do it. It's a slightly more advanced and we couldn't do it. So this paper clearly told us what were the advantages of a 3D detector over a 2D detector. And it covers larger portion of the space and there are lesser blind spots in this. You can understand it, right? Like if you have a planar thing, you are not at all detecting anything that's coming along the plane, essentially. You're detecting everything that's perpendicular, right? So if you have it in all orthogonal directions, you'll be able to detect it from different directions, essentially. Yeah, this sounded garbage when we proposed it, but as it turned out to be really good. Let's see if we get a detector like this. Yeah, any more questions, comments, anything?
Is it possible to do PhD in 2 different fields at the same time? Like, is it possible to do PhD in 2 different fields at the same time? Like one in gravitational wave astronomy, while other in quantum cosmology, something like that.
I'll have to really know about what you're referring to when you say.
No, I'm asking, can we do PhD at the 2 PhD at the same time? Like one in gravitational wave astronomy and other in quantum cosmology.
I'll have to really understand. That's what I said. I'll have to understand what you mean by quantum cosmology because your question requires addressal of a topic which is much more advanced. I can only tell you about gravitational wave astronomy at this point. Given only to address one particular frequency range, it is a whole weird set of parameters. I don't think it's very convenient or very easy to put in 2 different technologies together right in just one apparatus if you're referring to.
No. I'm asking, can we do PhD at the same two different? Can we write PhDs in 2 different fields at the same time?
Sorry, I can't answer that question. I'm not aware of what you're referring to as PhD. Pike Wink. It's actually
PhD degree. Philosophy of doctor, that PhD after masters.
Okay, PhD you're saying. Okay, I'm really sorry about that. I don't know, you have to check the program through.
No, that one I'm asking is, can we do a PhD in 2 different fields? Like gave 2 examples, gravitational wave astronomy and quantum cosmology at the same time.
Yeah, I think I have seniors here who can answer it. I really don't know about PhD and stuff. Okay, there are a few questions in the chat box.
Doing one PhD at the same doing one PhD is like a huge, work. Doing 2 at the same time is gonna be like, I don't know.
So is it possible or not?
Suspect, tell. Is it possible?
I don't know.
Clear assumption of capabilities. If it's possible.
Yeah, if you can work that much, 24, you'll have to work more than.
Can you do simultaneously? I don't know.
Possible, you can do. I don't know how probable it will be.
You can do it, but
the nearest I could think is something like dual degree, like that will be there maybe.
So Celestic is going to organize a special session for what all combination of PhDs you can do together. Yeah. We'll find speakers. Okay. I'll just address a few questions in the chat box. What is the mass scale that doesn't affect the gravitational wave propagation? Essentially, all through the planetary systems and the star systems, even if they're propagating, it causes length change of 10 to the power minus 18 meter. So you can say even on if you consider Earth, this isn't causing much problem for the gravitational wave. We are just finding a way to detect it. But you can consider the mass scale of even planets. That is the essential advantage and in a way disadvantage of detecting gravitational waves, that they are unimpeded. So they won't have had changes to the wave itself, to its intensity or whatever form. Okay, so planetary system don't cause much change to gravitational wave propagation. Yeah, it has to be outside the exosphere. Yes. Definitely have to keep it away from all the disturbances from that could possibly come from the atmosphere or nearest layers. Does the path difference differ between lasers we use? If you are still around, could you please explain me that question? Okay, cool. Is there any other question?
Just to add to that, amount of mass that can actually affect gravitational waves, gravitational lensing of gravitational waves is something that has been observed. So definitely you can have masses the size of galaxies and whatnot which can lens gravitational waves. So it appears as two sources or three sources depending upon its orientation. That's the only like kind of issue that like an optical something like scattering for optics. This is like the only analogy that I can give for gravitational waves is that you can get lensed. It can get lensed.
Oh wow! I thought gravitational lensing mostly referred to this bending of light across massive gravitational objects.
No,
but
no.
I'm not.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that's another thing where electromagnetic fields and gravitational fields, you can't draw analogies anymore. Which is that electric fields do not affect other electric fields, whereas gravitational waves affect gravitational fields affect gravitational fields. So for electric fields, it's only the sources that affect what the field strength is, whereas that's why gravity is a very nonlinear theory and very difficult to solve the equations, because fields produce more fields effectively. So fields can lens other fields.
This is super interesting. Yeah, my knowledge in the field, I'll be very honest, is very new in the sense that I came across this like a couple of months ago. So it's really interesting to know there are super cool concepts. Yeah, I can't wait to read GTR for that matter.
Yeah, you will be able to read it, but you won't be able to solve it.
We'll change the field. Yeah.
Where we came from electric field to this, just electric field we chose to know the force and we end up here.
Just a continuation to Vikasa's question, like, is it possible to detect gravitational waves on like galaxy scales? Like having the effect of the gravitational waves on galactic scales?
Oh, definitely. So wait. What? This was a question for Prarthana. Sorry.
No. You are answering it better. Trust me.
Yeah.
I'm saying you're answering it better. Please go on.
Oh, okay, sorry. What was the? I mean, you said something like galactic scale, right?
Yeah. Like, is it possible to have an effect of the gravitational wave on galactic scales?
Gravitational waves on galactic scales are not really. I mean, gravitational waves can be produced by galactic sources, but I do not know what you mean when you say galactic. Do you mean like waves that can actually like? I don't know. What do you mean when you say galactic scale?
Like when we discussed about the lens thing, I'm asking if it can affect like let's say a galaxy, maybe like I don't know, like something that huge, object that huge.
No. Usually, so what I'm trying to sense here is that you're trying to ask me if the position of a galaxy gets lensed because of gravitational waves passing through it. Is that what you mean?
Kinda, yes.
No, not really. Gravitational waves are very, as you said, even only near the sources they become extremely strong. But when you're actually observing it, at least we have not observed anything that we are not like basically we are not nearby any of the sources to observe fields as strong as what you're mentioning. We have, I mean, thankfully, we're not near any supermassive black holes.
Yeah, we'd be dead.
Yeah.
If that happens.
But theoretically, yes, if you have a source very close to a galaxy such that the fields are still strong enough for perturbations of, I mean, affecting the scale at which you talk about, sure. But we haven't observed anything.
Excuse me, I have a doubt actually. So the Einstein's representation of gravity. I mean, we are saying it by the curvature of space-time, right? could we actually measure the space-time curvature to indicate or say the intensity of the gravitational wave?
Yeah, so the deformation depends on how strong the gravity is, in a sense, how strong masses are, because in a way it's proportional. So, so if you have a black hole versus if you have just a planet versus a sun, say a star, so the deformation that it can produce in the space-time curvature will be totally different. So for a planet like ours, it will be really less compared to sun. For a black hole, the image that they show is actually a tunnel that just goes on. So it's like a massive depression. That's all.
Yeah, I mean, no. I meant the actual number. I mean, the value, the intensities value. Would we determine the gravitation waves value using the curvature?
I think you can find a correlation between the two, but that will employ field equations in GTR.
Another question.
Listen. Gravitational waves are changes in curvature. So when you measure gravitational waves, you are in fact measuring curvature, changes in curvature. They're not two different things. Gravitational waves do not cause curvature. Gravitational waves are curvature changes.
Yeah, he's also referring to the intensity of the gravitational waves corresponding to the curvature, in a sense, something like that.
I think the detectors, when we sense the gravitational waves, from that we can get an idea of the intensity, right? If you get the question.
Yeah, I think Vikas said it correct. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
It's exactly space-time curvature. So you can just directly say, yeah, the exact number would require, I think, some mathematical form, but you can just say if greater the space-time deformation, greater
the heavier the masses, right? And I just wanted to ask one thing. Could we determine the tensile strength of any space-time? I mean, can we determine, or is it a imaginable quantity or space-time, or what do you call it? Is it really there, or are we using the space-time to display gravity or a gravitational wave, some sort of?
I am not sure, but if I were to see, the whole concept of it is mathematical. You're not seeing things out there. In the mathematical framework, you can talk about the tensile strength and all that you're referring to. But how exactly you do it, or is it how real, how unreal, would require me to read about it, which I'm not familiar with, so I'll not take a wild guess at it.
Ma'am, hello?
Yes.
So gravitational wave is totally different from EM wave. We can't compare these two like waves like that.
Yes. Yeah, they are different, but there is fair amount of analogy between Maxwell equations, field equations, and their solutions. So in a way, for our understanding, we can form an analogy to give it a more physical picture because we understand electromagnetic waves really well. But the behavior of gravitational waves and electromagnetic waves are indeed very different.
So the form of gravitational wave can't have like sinusoidal like that, like we used to write in EM waves form, right? Like E naught sine of kx minus omega t, like that form it will not have.
It will. Okay, let me show you something. Yeah, this paper gives a very nice. It's actually someone of our age who has done this, so you can just check it out. What is happening is the way you're describing the gravitational wave is in terms of, say, amplitude, say h. Okay, the way it's causing the frequency at which it's causing this change in the length of these arms is you define this as half cycle. So essentially, it is oscillatory in nature because once if this arm is expanding, the next moment it's contracting, the next moment it's expanding. So this time span gives you how this oscillation is happening. So in a way, it is in fact sinusoidal. So you can use essentially the same framework of the way you describe sinusoidal behavior of electromagnetic waves to describe gravitational waves too.
Oh, okay.
Since it's 4-dimensional, is it a combination of sine and cos waves at the same time?
So you can refer this paper to dig deep into the mathematical forms of these things.
Just a curious question. Okay, so this was a theoretical concept. Okay, not an actual concept. So let us say that I'm having an earthquake, and at the same
Sorry.
time,
Repeat. I lost you. Yeah.
yeah, let us say that I'm having an earthquake. There's an earthquake happening. Similar time is an gravitational like theoretically can we detect the changes in the seismic waves which are caused by the earthquake and the changes which are caused by the gravitational waves. Like, can we detect the changes theoretically?
The noise will definitely register in the signal as seismic noise. That can actually, I thought of it like you can use it as earthquake detector, the intensity and all, because in a way you're getting the signal anyways. So you can tell okay if there's an earth, because first of all the site that they choose is such that it's away from most volcanic activities and all. But suppose if we have it, yes, you can detect because you're getting seismic noise signal, right? So you should be able to tell theoretically what was the intensity on this Richter scale or whatever, however you want to analyze it. And okay, the second thing you said, the signal of the gravitational wave will you be able to detect at the same time? It will become even more challenging because the seismic noise will be more pronounced. So trying to get out that minuscule signal out of a whole bunch of seismic noise will be really, really difficult.
Like my question was like theoretically, can I do it that using a seismograph, using a seismometer? Theoretically, if I have sensitive enough seismometer, which we can't, of course, but theoretically.
To detect gravitational waves.
Yeah.
The scales would be massively different, right? Gravitational waves and
yeah.
So theoretically, if we get technology that is sensitive enough, then why not? But I don't think that is possible, right?
No, even I don't think even theoretically it is possible. It's not possible. Seismograph works on a whole different principle than interferometer. Seismograph measures mechanical vibrations. There are no mechanical vibrations that an interferometer measures.
Yeah.
Right? So gravitational waves do not cause mechanical vibrations that seismographs can pick up on. They cause changes in distances.
And another thing, does a gravitational wave pose dual nature, like particle and wave nature? Because long ago I heard there was research being conducted to about gravitons. Is that actually true or?
I'm not very aware with I'm not thorough with this topic. So if there are other people who have already read about gravitons and who know much about particle physics and all, can take up this.
It's a hypothesis.
It's a hypothetical concept. It's like a quanta of gravity, but it's hypothetical.
And that association with gravitational waves, that I think essentially.
It's like they're trying to like the hypothesis. I believe is that they're trying to hypothesize a dual nature involving graviton as the quanta, but it is not proved and it's still hypothetical. So yeah.
Like out of the four fundamental forces, the three are electromagnetic, weak and strong. Three of them are connected by like quantum mechanics, like the dual nature particles. But the gravitation is still not like in that sense connected to the quantum physics. Like people still are trying to like merge them together to find out how the one single force was like.
As far as I know, there was one like while considering the existence of a graviton, there was some mathematical like they couldn't account for the graviton. So is it still in progress? I don't know. I think it was discontinued, right? That theory. I'm not sure. I think there was an error. No, I mean they couldn't account for it while solving the field equations.
Okay, thank you.
Ma'am, one doubt, ma'am. Ma'am, in polar regions, the curvature of Earth is low, right? At least comparing to that equator. Then why don't we have any LIGO there or any other gravity interferometer there?
Sorry again. How you're placing it? Like you're placing it on top of the pole? Do you mean?
Yes, like that.
How does it reduce the curvature? You'll still have curvature,
I mean,
right?
Earth naturally is as radius, I radius in equator, right? While low in polar region, so it will have low curvature like that. I'm thinking.
So you have to. So the correction involved for the curvature can be done on even on the equator. Okay. The point is it giving you advantages over the noises that are already present? If it's doable, you can have a plant there. If it's first problem would be to set up a massive infrastructure out there, which can be done, but it's more challenging than doing it right here near
I
the
think
institutes and all.
it's better
But
to have a correction of, like, if in case there is some error due to this physical location, the correction can be done easily in like more accessible place. Like if we consider the Earth as a perfect sphere, then there shouldn't be any correction. But if we consider it as a geoidal structure, then we can make a correction in the like well established labs and the places here instead of going all the way there.
the problem boils down
Even
to having
even
infrastructure out there on the poles. Then
even with that, like even if you like let's say if you have a set amount poles, it will increase the noises because like the winds on the poles are very unpredictable and very fast. Like you might have heard about that. So like
right.
sometimes you can have like a really big storms happening on the poles, which are like so yeah. The winds can give
Yeah,
like the
even
wind will also increase the noise.
yeah, to add to that, you also have like the particles from the solar wind usually, which move away from the equator towards the pole. So that noise will be considerable if you're having it on the ground.
Oh, is it from equator? It is moving to pole. I mean, the
Mm.
magnetic field is I in pole, right? From pole it originates, so it moves towards equator, right?
It's the basic principle, same as the formation of
It's the
aurora.
other
So
way around.
I'm I'm just explaining it on the basis of how you explain auroras, right? So you have this
Okay.
solar wind that's coming in because of the magnetic field of the Earth. They're deflected towards the poles, and hence you get the colors on the poles and not really where you live. So because of all that, since you have more particles, there would be an increased amount of noise because it is a sensitive instrument. So yeah, like Swastik said, keeping in mind the storm, the infrastructure, the problem of going there, maintaining it.
If this much noise is there, then it can be used for detecting earthquakes, right? Related to, after all, this is also mechanical things you are saying, like storm and solar wind, like that.
It can be used to detect it, but
See, the
that's not the primary
scales are
objective of.
very different, right? We are calibrating the instruments to detect gravitational waves. So if we detect earthquake, seismic waves and all, it will be detected as low scale noise there. We're not tuning it for earthquakes.
Yeah,
Earthquakes, they are
but
meant
it will
For
be
earthquake,
registered
you
as a
can
noise. It will be registered as a noise. If you're interested, you extract that particular part of the noise plot. But the configuration is solely, like Arnab said, will be focused on detection of gravitational waves and not really earthquakes and other things. But there is fair
for
amount of signals you can get out of it.
But if we try
earthquake.
to manipulate the size of tube, then we can use it suitably, right, for earthquake. Like,
That's not the point of a gravitational wave detector. You get it right. I mean, you are making a far sophisticated instrument not to detect something that you can detect using a seismograph and other
you
things.
can detect seismic waves using the seismograph that is there for that particular purpose.
okay,
Gravitational waves
okay.
detectors are for that scale. Like gravitational waves become very large scale thing compared to this. So
Plus the cost. Like for earthquakes, you can just hang a pen and put a piece of paper below that. It will detect an earthquake. The gravitational waves, it's gonna cost like a huge amount of money. No one is gonna pay you like that much money just to do an earthquake.
Do that.
Oh. So,
If you have any more questions, we can take it. Or I think it's 6:30. We have another session by Classical Arts Club. So maybe we can
Yeah.
break
So,
if you don't have any other questions.
thank you, ma'am.
You don't have to call me ma'am.
so I think
Thanks for
like
joining, guys.
yeah, I think we'll stop here.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks a lot for that interesting and interactive session, Fatima. was a really exciting one. Thank you very much, and thank you all for joining. Who came also who are left early. So we'll stop here and we'll see you in the next session. Have a great day. Bye.
Thank you.
A nice Star Wars reference.
Thank you, Prarthana. It
Yeah,
was very
I
informative.
think, yeah, thank you, Vikas. Yeah, when I put it there, I was like, okay, only one person will be truly happy, and that is you. Okay.
Yeah, it's
Nice
like
talk.
looking at that, I think I'm gonna watch Star Wars now.
Please watch.
He hasn't watched Star Wars, dude. Seriously.
You'll get really annoyed when they use parsec as a unit of time. Okay.
What?
Okay, in one scene.
Okay,
In one scene.
I'm leaving because like if this is Star Wars
Spoiler
discussion.
birthday. Spoiler
Okay,
birthday.
cool.
Spoiler birthday.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
Yeah.